Hey guys, a few of my episodes, I call them pod courses, are now approved for NBCC continuing education, and you can grab your first pod course for free. So head to my site, lisamustard.com, and sign up to get your free contact hour. Yes, I said for free. Who doesn't love free?
As counselors, we're going through a lot of the same stressors and situations through COVID, through the election that our clients are going through. And so I think wellness and addressing and identifying where our focus is as counselors is even more critical because we may not be able to provide the perspective that we've been traditionally used to as counselors because we're dealing with the same things our clients have been dealing with, which is somewhat unique in this time and space.
Welcome to the Therapy Show podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Mustard. In each episode, I interview a seasoned and knowledgeable talk therapist from the counseling world to glean valuable insights, techniques, and tools that you can apply to your practice and your life. And if you're considering a career in the counseling field or just want to hear about what it's like to be a talk therapist, then this is the podcast for you. In this pod course, I interview Seth Scott, PhD, NCC, LPC, LPC-S, and he presents Your Focus Determines Your Direction. He covers a philosophical concept of the topic and then moves into the practical, personal, and clinical implications for therapists. We hope you enjoy his presentation. I find it to be very, very relevant and also super helpful as I move forward in my personal and professional lives. Remember, if you are enjoying this pod course and would like to receive continuing education credit, head to my site, lisamustard.com, click on pod courses, and you can then purchase the quiz and evaluation. And once you've completed those, you will receive a certificate of completion. Okay, let's dive into the episode. Well, welcome everyone to another episode of The Therapy Show. I'm your host, Lisa Mustard, and today's episode is actually a pod course. I am talking with Dr. Seth Scott, and he is going to tell us a little bit about who he is and what he does. But the topic for this pod course is titled, Your Focus Determines Your Direction. So welcome to the show, Dr. Scott. I'm so excited to have you here.
Great. Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, this is really cool. I know you and I connected last year sometime ago at Columbia International University. You are a professor there, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay.
I'm an associate professor at CIU. I teach in the grad counseling program, predominantly in the clinical counseling track. So it's a MA pursuing licensure as a clinical mental health counselor in South Carolina.
Very cool. So I love to ask my guests, how did you decide to become a counselor?
Yeah, it was an interesting progression. Growing up, my dad was the director of a drug and alcohol rescue mission outside New York City. I grew up right outside Manhattan and in New Jersey. And I have two older brothers, and we all said we're never going to go into what my dad does. I think his perspective was he wanted to kind of be old and semi-senile, sitting in a rocking chair while we kind of ran the ministry that he developed. And we didn't want any part of that. But kind of as I hit college, I pursued a degree in intercultural studies. My wife and I got married. We went to Ireland to do some church planning and small group discipleship. And in working with people, we realized that we had training in addressing culture and we had training in addressing aspects of kind of biblical studies and the gospel, but people still had concerns, had problems. After we had addressed those things, and we realized we needed more training. And so I decided to go back to go to grad school for counseling, went to Regent University in Virginia Beach and got my clinical counseling degree, and then pursued additional training in working predominantly with adolescents and young adults in crisis in the New England area, and then also added some work with couples counseling and addiction before getting into teaching. So I continue private practice and supervision, but I was teaching undergrad counseling for about 7 years in Iowa, and then pursuing my PhD while I was doing that, completed my PhD, and I've been here at CIU for 2 years. I'm in my second year and just teaching in the grad school at this point.
Nice. Well, you've lived all over the country, pretty much.
I have, yeah.
It's pretty wild. That's really cool. And I know I've sat in on a number of your presentations, and they're always great. And I'm really excited for you to cover this topic today. And I want to share with our listeners the learning objectives that you're going to cover. So, number one, explore and define the role of attention and attending to thinking, feeling, and behavior. I love that. I can't wait to hear more about that. Number 2, define strategies for effective counselor wellness for self and modeling for others. And that's so, not only is this like amazing for a therapist to learn more about our own self-care and wellness, but I would love to, maybe we can talk about how it is now more than ever during this pandemic of COVID. Plus, just as you and I record this, we still aren't sure who our next president's going to be. So there's a lot going on right now. And number 3, explain the role of counselor identity on wellness and practice. So I'm excited to jump into that. And just so you guys know, listening, Dr. Scott has some slides that we will upload to the show notes. So you can grab these. If you are listening to this podcast while you're walking or working out, don't worry, you can just head to the podcourses page or the therapy show page, and I will have a link to the show notes where you can grab them once you're not moving or driving. We don't want anybody driving, trying to pull show notes up. So, okay, you want to start with number 1, just explore and define the role of attention and attending to thinking, feeling, and behavior. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've noticed just in kind of working in counseling, but especially in these past couple of weeks, even as we look at a country divided on political issues, it's amazing that people can look at the same situation and see completely different things. And so, there was examples in the past couple of years. There was a picture that went around the internet of a blue and black dress or a white and gold dress. Everyone was looking at the same picture. But some people were convinced that the dress was blue and black. Others were convinced it was gold and white. Even now, looking at our country, we have people looking at the same information and seeing something very different. And where I grew up, right outside New York City, we would say, what are you looking at? We'd usually mean, mind your own business. We don't mean that here, but it does determine that the source of our focus, either in the direction we're going or the content that we're looking at, can determine where we go. And there's some research in psychology, it's called the moth effect. And it's the idea that where people will unconsciously move in the direction of their gaze. And so as you're looking at something, that's where your feet will take you. And so it's important to make sure that we're looking in the right direction. And so as we've had this year that's just kind of filled with crazy media content, lots of noise that fills our vision, lots of competing content, lots of competing emotions, we have this kind of traditional CBT model of behavior, feelings, and thoughts that's important as we try to change these things. But I've come to recognize actually that because all of those things are tied together, where we're looking informs all of those things at the same time. And so one of the best ways actually to make adjustments to how we think, how we feel, and how we behave or believe is to change where we're looking or change where we're going. And so that's part of what we kind of want to explore as we look at what we can control.
Now, this applies for a therapist for sure, but this also is going to kind of parallel probably a lot of the work we do with our clients. So I'm interested to hear more about that as well, because we're going to focus on therapists, right?
Yeah.
But if we can maybe touch on that idea for our clients too, because it's parallel process for sure.
That's right. Yeah. So it is interesting that one of the things that often makes counseling effective is that as counselors, we can provide a different perspective for our clients. They can only see what's immediately in front of them. Often as our world kind of closes in, we get overwhelmed, our view gets constricted. And when that view gets constricted, we have a harder time seeing alternatives or seeing scope. And so as counselors, traditionally, we're not in the moment. So we've been able to see bigger and help clients expand their vision, see it from different perspectives. But one of the interesting things about this past year, I think, is that as counselors, we're going through a lot of the same stressors and situations through COVID, through the election that our clients are going through. And so I think wellness and addressing and identifying where our focus is as counselors is even more critical, because we may not be able to provide the perspective that we've been traditionally used to as counselors, because we're dealing with the same things our clients have been dealing with, which is somewhat unique in this time and space.
Right. Okay. I can totally relate to what you're saying. So where do you want to go next with that?
Yeah. So, I think what this means then is even as we think through kind of the means of practice is being aware of what is going to trigger where we're looking. And so one of the things that happens, I think, is while masks are helpful, right? Everywhere we go, we see people with masks. We're constantly reminded of danger, of safety, of the need to pursue safety. And so where we're looking again, is going to determine how we think, how we feel, what direction is. And so what is deemed normal will also be determined that way. And so we even, as we've said, I think one of your previous guests has said, where your focus goes, your energy flows. And I think that's so true. And so as we look around, if we start only seeing what's directly in front of us, we enter what's called, what I call a downward D spiral of kind of disappointment, discouragement, disillusionment, and then despair and depression. Things get closed in, we get more constrictive. And so part of this process, as in most things, is that growth and change occurs through insight first. We have to be aware of what we aren't aware of. We have to be aware of what's happening before we can change it.
That's really helpful. So how do you apply this do you mind sharing how you apply it? Because I know how I apply it and I can give an example, I think.
Yeah. So yeah, I apply it regularly I need kind of cross checks. I need people to be able to bounce ideas off of so that I can confirm my position. In the same way that, we use GPS with multiple satellites to tell us where we are, we need other people with multiple perspectives to confirm our current position. And they need to be in different locations, right? They need opposing perspectives. They need different histories, different experiences, so that our position is better triangulated to where we know we are.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. I was thinking more about, media and the news and where I get information from. And, it's easy to stay focused on one type of news or only one network but it's important, I think, to get all sides and to see all the different perspectives. And like you said, have a conversation, talk with people that you trust, that you can have, safe conversations. And I think that can be difficult for some people. They don't feel safe having those conversations. So what a great space to do it in your therapy sessions with your counselor or, whether that be the counselor getting the counseling. But yeah, that's a great way, a good example for sure.
It is a unique time in that, we have more information and news of what's happening around the world than we've ever had before. The world seems smaller than it's ever been before. And yet the variety of our input is actually less diverse than it's ever been before because of kind of how our information is fed. And so, yeah, historically, we maybe would have received a broader and more diverse perspective on different issues. But with the way the world is designed, actually, we are probably being fed less diverse information than since a while in human history, which then just reinforces our current perspective.
Right. And I want to go back to what you said about the moth effect. If you start on that path of looking or seeing things, or you go down and you said this, the D spiral, what did you call it?
Yeah, the downward D spiral. Yeah.
That downward D. Yeah. I have been feeling that the past, 2 weeks now. I've really felt the downward D spiral, and I've had to work really hard to not allow myself to go down that spiral. Do you have, I know we'll get into that probably with learning objective number 2, maybe we're there. How do you propose that we combat that?
Yeah, so I think one of the easiest ways when we're stuck, we have the cognitive behavioral triangle. We have thinking, feeling, and doing. Mm-hmm. And frequently, if our thinking is just reinforced, that tends to be kind of the approach that traditional cognitive behavioral addresses is, well, just change how you're thinking. But a lot of habits that we inform are what actually cause us to kind of move in the direction that we go. And so one of the things I think that's happening that is increasing our stress and strain is that the habits that we're used to are changed now with COVID, with changes in schooling, with changes in lockdowns, with changes in work, even doing this call through Zoom, right? All of these elements are different for us. And so we're making more decisions regularly, and the things that we had in habit aren't working the same. And so what happens is then we're stuck in one position. And so we only see things from that position. Well, in the same way that you might climb to the top of a mountain to get a broader view, one of the best things that we can do is actually change our position to change our perspective. And so instead of staying where you were, it's being able to go to a different position, see it through someone else's eyes, move to a new location. And actually the act of moving, of changing our behavior, can then change how we feel about something and change how we think about something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. Let's give a couple examples maybe of maybe aside from COVID and election, because I don't want to go down the spiral, the D spiral. I don't want to go there.
Yeah. So, one of the common things that we do in counseling is when you're in that kind of downward spiral, that's all you're seeing. And so by changing what you're looking at each day, by maybe going for a walk outside in a new place, or writing a list of blessings that you experience at the end of every day, or taking a new way to work, changing some of those behaviors that we do will change how we view life. Painting rooms different colors, all of those things are a means of having different input than what we were used to before.
Right. So you could just say you could change one or two little things and you could have a new perspective on what's going on. Yeah.
It does. It makes a difference.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to think of recent things that I've done. With our kids now being at home 3 days, well, they were up until last week were e-learning. And so they didn't have to log in until a certain time. So and that time was pushed back from the normal time they go to school. So we've been sleeping in a little bit more and kind of pushing breakfast back a little bit more. And in the beginning, I pushed really hard to stay on the schedule. We have to get up at the same time. We have to do all the things that we did. But that just made everything more stressful for our family. Back in March, I was like, so we sat down as a family and kind of agreed on the new normal. What's this going to look like? And how are we going to adapt? And how are we going to, I don't want to say ease up, but just, shift things a little bit. So we kind of got into that routine and things started to get into flow. And now that we're going back to school 2 days a week, we're, but at the same time has evolved and things have shifted again. And the girls are like excited to get up and go to school now. They hop out of bed, they can't wait to get to school and be around their peers. So I think that's one thing that kind of comes to mind for me. And then just how I do work has changed for sure. And I'm guessing how you teach has changed and you had to make accommodations. And I bet that's really wild because you're not seeing your students in class every day. You're seeing them on a computer screen.
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, where I teach at Columbia International University, we've decided that for the majority of our courses, we are still residential. And so while we maintain distancing and wear masks, we've been able to do a lot. I teach half my classes in person and then half online. It is interesting in, teaching the first year students, I've only met wearing masks. And so I'm anticipating having to relearn all of their names if this goes away, because there's good reason why historically, bandits wear masks to cover the bottom half of their faces. You can't really tell who a person is when they're wearing a mask.
That's so true. I go to the grocery store and I don't know who I'm like. I think I know that person. Is that so-and-so? Yeah, it's pretty wild.
And that's a big change even for perspective as well, is, you see somebody and it's hard to tell what their mood or emotional state is when all you can see is their eyes. And so even, sometimes taking a moment at a safe distance and pulling your mask down to be able to show and express emotion, to be human again, I think helps to kind of cut through the fear and uncertainty that we experience today.
Yeah, gosh, for sure.
So a component of this position perspective is, I think one of the things that happens when we change our position is that it enables us to change this perspective, both in kind of moving to a new place, but we can also change our perspective through its recognition. So a huge component of perspective is Carol Dweck's research on mindset, which I think is really important for counselors, but also for counselors then to teach all of their clients. So Carol Dweck's concept is growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And it's kind of how we view ourselves in relation to the world, and then how we view challenges and obstacles that we experience in life. She notes that it's through failure that we learn. And so it's how we deal with or perceive the role of struggle and failure in our experience, and kind of our acceptance and willingness to be okay with that in moving forward in life.
Yeah, I think that's really key. Gosh, as a therapist, for sure, being able to have a growth mindset. And it's good to know when we have clients, kind of which camp they might be in. And I'm guessing with some topics and some things, you might be more of a growth mindset than others. So there's probably, I guess, is there a spectrum, you think?
Yeah, I think it exists on, we all exist on spectrums for the majority of things. And I think even Dweck's research notes that in some areas of life, we may tend more towards a growth mindset. In other areas of life, we tend to be more fixed, because she says, this mindset is the view that we adopt of ourselves, and it affects how we lead our life. So it's these qualities of what we think we can change and what we can't change. And so there might be aspects of our life that we say, yeah, I've grown in this area. I can see how things have improved. And we might even hold that about ourselves and not hold it about other people, feeling that people are stuck and predetermined.
One of the things, it just kind of reminds me, but one of the things that I like to remind myself is when I encounter something that's difficult or I feel stuck with, and I feel like I'm kicking the wall, I'm having those wall kicking moments, and I have a lot of those, most people do. I like to remind myself like, okay, well, what other areas of your life have you been able to problem solve and troubleshoot and grow through? Because Lisa, you can do this. But that took a learning, that took an experience for me to kind of, have that insight. So I just, I think that's important as we evolve as humans. And then as therapists, remember that we've been through hard things. I mean, gosh, going through grad school, like think about the very first time your instructor said, today is the day you're going to sit with your first family. Because I have a marriage and family therapy background. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're going to let me do this. But I often think back to that moment when I go, okay, well, you did it. Like you can do hard things, you can evolve, you can grow. So I just want folks to kind of think through that, like think of an experience or life, some stuff you've been through that maybe you're stuck with right now, but remember, you've been through that growth process before. So.
Right. And I mean, one of the critical things in being able to feel like we're growing is that we need a means for measuring our growth. It's similar to with my kids, is I'm with them every day. And so sometimes I don't notice that they're growing. Right. They're getting bigger. And you notice when they put on a pair of pants that they wore last year and now, there's high flood going on. They don't fit anymore. Oh, wow, you've grown, or you measure them against the height chart. And so for ourselves, actually, both as just people and as counselors, it's important to make sure that we have enough things in place that we're working on that we can measure. Yeah. So that, I mean, as counselors working with people, it's hard to measure that growth. Part of my balance as a therapist has been doing house repairs and flips in real estate on the side while also doing counseling, because I'm working with a person. Sometimes it's really hard to gauge progress and growth, but when I paint a wall, I can see the change from beginning to end very drastically. And so I think for us as people, and we do that well, usually as counselors in doing treatment goals and action steps that are concrete and measurable, but across our areas of life as a counselor too, it's hard to gauge that. And if we're only gauging growth and progress by our perceived success rate of clients, that's hard to gauge as well, because I've yet to have a client who is doing really well come back and let me know that.
Right.
And so you have this assumption that you only hear from people that aren't doing well. And so it's setting up some of those pieces in place that you can measure your own growth and feel like you're making some difference.
Yeah. How do you, if you don't mind me asking, how do you measure your own growth?
Well, so I have a whole bunch of different metrics in place. And so I have different standards or expectations for myself, some of which involve doing writing and research. And so kind of one of the things I've discovered since finishing my PhD was I wanted to maintain the pace that I was working on then. And so I know that if I don't have deadlines like I had in grad school, it's going to be harder to do it. And so I tend to apply for presentations at different conferences. Part of me hoping that my presentation isn't accepted because it's overwhelming to do it. But then when it is accepted, then I have that deadline and urgency to be able to kind of put those presentations together, do the research, get those things done. Even signing up for doing podcasts like this, knowing, all right, well, I need to prepare myself, and so I'm going to kind of continue to push myself in research and reading and those things. So that's one aspect. As a counselor, some of the things I do is I make sure that I write good treatment plans to begin with. I kind of like those as a therapist. I like those first few sessions where it's just kind of chaos. And you're trying to evaluate and assess what's actually going on and conceptualize it in a way that we can make concrete goals. And so I do that and hold myself to creating those action steps and treatment plans so that I can gauge progress with the client as well. So making them small enough and making enough of them that I can gauge progress. And then in my life, it's just kind of setting concrete goals of I'm going to run this many times a week. I'm going to maintain these disciplines in my life with my family, those type of things.
Yeah. So it's similar for me as well. I was just kind of running through, different goals that I have for myself and how I measure them. And, I think your example of your kids with the pants. That's happening around here a good bit too. Must be like some growth spurt going on in our house. But I think that makes really good sense. And for me, when many years ago, one of the things that I wanted to work on in counseling was just how I would react to other people's shoulds of what I, in my life. And so I would measure it by, well, how many emotional reactive moments did I have this week, or sometimes this hour, depending on who I was around. And, over the years, like I can see how practicing that and working on that now, it's when I have one, I'm so surprised by it. I'm like, oh, what's going on, Lisa? Like it's still a metric for me that I check in with myself and go, what's going on with you that you're so, reactive to that conversation or what was just said. So that's kind of where I went with it. But then I can also see, for sure, like I love to go to the gym. So what am I doing in the gym? Am I making progress there with how much weight I'm using? Or, and for some folks who want to get into better health or better shape, how are their clothes fitting? Are they fitting differently? Are they getting more sleep? Are they drinking more water? Like those are metrics that you can measure. And as therapists, those are things that we often check in with our clients anyway, because sleep is so important and eating healthy is so important. So that's great. Really.
So an important starting point for any goal is being able to determine where we are right now. Because if we want to say, I would like to be here in the future, then I need to know where I am to be able to establish patterns and steps to get to where I want to go. And so we have this self-assessment moment of saying, where am I and what is my goal to where I want to go? And in my mind, we'll talk about this in a minute as well, is this idea of, is our goal just the absence of something, or is it the promotion of something? So as counselors, I think instead of just trying to work on our clients to have an absence of mental illness or pathology, one of the unique elements of counseling versus some of the other helping fields is that our goal is wellness and health and prevention, and not just the absence of illness. And so setting some of those goals, and then in order to then move, we need to be able to define what this destination looks like, and then establish some measurement points, some mile markers to be able to track our progress and maintain our pace as we go.
Yes. So let's look at understanding self-assessment. So what is the goal? And I like how you said the absence of mental illness or the creation of health and wellness. Now, I remember in grad school, for my program, it was definitely strength focused, creating something new, not always based on a diagnosis or having a label or the medical model. When you make that statement, where are you with that, I guess?
Yeah, I guess my ideal would be, as much as we don't like the dentist, I wish counseling were more like going to the dentist, in that we have a culture in the United States of going to the dentist every 6 months for checkups and cleanings, whether you need it or not, whether you have a toothache or not, you go to the dentist, because we have a mentality around prevention. And I think we have that in physical health and medicine as well. It's just not maybe as clearly defined. The side piece for counselors too is that regardless of what insurance you have or how much insurance is going to pay, the bill is the same from the dentist as well, which is not true for counseling. But trying to kind of build that mentality, that perspective within our culture, climate, and even among us as counselors, that there should be a means of providing help and support towards health that doesn't require a pathological diagnosis. And so many of us do this by utilizing the adjustment disorders and things like that. But even that is the assumption, although any adjustment can cause concern, it still is a framework of illness versus health. And so I guess my push personally would be to try to establish some model for counseling that follows the trajectory that we have across other forms of health and healthcare, that encourages prevention and wellness and not just correction of pathology or sickness.
Right. I remember when I worked in addiction therapy, one of the things that we often talked about, because if you're in recovery, like if you're in a program, an IOP, you've got a label, you've got a diagnosis, right? You are an addict. You're brought in, you've got the label, you got the diagnosis. But so much of the work that we did was was saying to them, you have to learn how to deal with life on life's terms. And I go back to that statement, life on life's terms, because so much of life we can't control, right? It's all we can control is how we react and respond. And I know I keep going back to like, the time we're living in right now, but this is like a test for a lot of people. This is life on life's terms. There's not much we can do about controlling it we have to make the decision how we are going to respond and react to it. So in a sense, this is a big checkup. I don't know. I kind of see it like that. So yeah, I love that idea of prevention and just kind of a check-in. I think that's really wise in promoting health. And yeah. And like you said earlier, people don't go to therapy when things are good.
Right.
They only go when there's an issue or a problem or they're struggling. So imagine our sessions if we had clients come in and pay us our fee and just talk about how awesome things were going. And you would feel like, oh, I shouldn't charge you for this, just, I don't know. It's an interesting concept.
Yeah, I think it'll require kind of a reworking of our own perspective and identity of what is it that we do. I know in counseling couples and in people in crisis, I did mostly kind of pre and post psychiatric hospitalization care of crisis stabilization in New England. And it was almost easier because it was so extreme, right? That people go, if you kept people alive today, you've succeeded. And then when you got to the more stubborn issues, they were referred for long-term counseling. So when you have couples come that have major affairs or issues, you kind of know what to do. But when couples want to go from having a good marriage to having a great marriage, it is a little bit more work. And so I think as counselors, we might need to change some of how we view ourselves, because we need to make sure that our persona is kind of framed around some of this aspect of health. And I think that ties to what we're seeing actually of this added stress, because as counselors, we are dealing with a lot of the same situations that our clients are dealing with right now. It does create this perspective around struggle and identity of what does it mean for us if our life isn't going as well as we would hope it to be? Do we feel like we're still able to provide input? Or do we practice what we teach, as counselors? What happens when we are struggling? And how do we handle that? What is our worth or what is our identity? David Benner says that our persona is how we want others to see us, and our identity is how we see and understand ourselves. And one of the ways we can kind of get an understanding of our identity is how we introduce ourselves to others. And so even thinking as counselors, kind of what does that mean for us when we say, oh, well, I'm a mental health counselor? Yeah. Usually that means that our friends either tell us their problems or they clam up because they're afraid of being diagnosed, at least in my experience.
Yeah, or I get kind of the other way around of, well, you should know better because you're a therapist, or you should know how to handle it, or you should. There's so many shoulds. So I don't know. I have people, I went through a phase about 2 years ago when people asked me what I did, and I didn't really want to tell them what I did. Because it was, oh, can I ask you a question? let me get, and it would be like, oh gosh, I don't want to work in the Publix. Like, I don't want to answer your question over by the coconut milk. Like, no, this is weird. But at the same time, I worked so hard for this degree and I worked so hard for this license, and I'm so proud of this work. So there's a little bit of ego there too, that kicks in.
Yeah, and I think this is where that second objective comes in, where it's so important to be able to define what wellness looks like for us, so that we're never going to have it perfect.
Right.
And people don't come to me as a counselor because I necessarily am doing what they want to do. They're not modeling after me. They're coming to me because of my training and experience and my capacity to provide perspective. This was important to me. And one of my first clients was a man in his late 60s who had just lost his wife. And I was like 25 years old. And so he says, how can you, first he wanted to know if I was married. And then he wanted to know kind of how I could even help him dealing with the grief and loss of his wife of 45 years. And my response was, well, I can't from my personal experience, but I can from my training. And I can from kind of a stance of knowing what's worked for other people. Right. And so that's part of that tension, I think, that we deal with is we need to have some things together. Hopefully we're not like Carl Jung, sleeping with a revolver under our pillow every night, that we have some semblance of self-care, safety, wellness, but our identity shouldn't hinge on our capacity to have everything perfect before we can help other people as well.
Right. Yeah. And I know that's a big, well, not big, but for some therapists, that's kind of an issue that they struggle with in the beginning. I remember having those conversations with my supervisor when I was in grad school and, working with families. I didn't have a family yet. So I was always like, how am I going to help a family if I don't know what it's like to be a mom? And he's like, well, you don't really know. You don't have to know what it's like to be a mom. You just have to have the training on it. I was like, okay. All right. Okay. That starts to make sense to me. So yeah, I like how you're framing how we can see ourselves. It's really, really helpful.
And like most people, I worked with teens and I was an expert on teens, but now that my kids are reaching that stage, a lot of my expertise isn't working the same, right? It's the distance and perspective that works, and our capacity to be consistent in what we do. That's so important.
And that's so true. That's really wise. I'm glad that you brought that up. I struggle with that too. My daughters at their ages and their stages. So on the slide here, you have what happens when we are struggling. Do we practice what we teach? I think that's a really interesting question that I want our listeners to kind of think about. I don't necessarily think that, you and I have the answer for them, but they have the answer for themselves. But do you have any insight into that or anything you want to share when it comes to that?
I mean, I think it's that recognition and willingness to have other people that can speak into your life, to give people permission to help you in the same way that we have permission in other people's lives to provide input and support. And also having these regular means for calibration checks to say, how am I actually doing? Am I practicing these different things and taking some of those measurements regularly so that we know that whether we're healthy or not. And I think especially now, right, we're so out of rhythm with life. Our structures, our habits, our supports are so different now because just life is different. Some of the things that maybe we've relied on in the past, I know for a lot of counselors, I used to teach for years that you go to work in the morning, and when you get to work, your kind of work mindset as a counselor starts. And that as counselors, how important it is to kind of have a checkpoint on the way home or when you walk out of the office so that your counseling stuff stays behind. Well, now that a lot of us are working out of our homes, we don't have that same air gap between our job and our life. And I know for the students that we're teaching that are in their internship, I mean, they're grad students, maybe renting a room. And so all of life in sleep, in personal life, in school life, in counseling life are occurring in the same room. And so the importance of just implementing new positive direction and having input from others to make sure that they're healthy, that they're maintaining focus and that they're able to instill positive direction and identity and wellness in place of someone carrying all of our clients' stuff.
Right. I think that's a really good point. And to think about those grad students that are in that one room all the time. They're sleeping, eating, and seeing clients all in that one room. I bet the walls feel like they might be closing in on them.
Yeah.
I know one of the things that has helped me over the years is like a peer group. And we would get together and we would have like peer supervision, but then we would also be able to check in with each other and just kind of, as we ladies say, let our hair down and just kind of be real with each other and ask for help if we needed it. And it's a good place if you need, being vulnerable with other peers can be such a blessing if you're not afraid of that. Get some really good feedback and get some good like peer supervision. But then also one of the things that on the flip side of that, I have been incorporating since the lockdown back in March, I started to walk more, just get outside and walk from like away from the house, because if I'm at home and I'm outside, I see something that needs to be done, or I remember I need to do this, or, oh my gosh, my kids can come and get me. So being able to like have that, but at the same time, I couldn't go to the gym, couldn't go certain places, but I could get out and walk. And I remember seeing so many people this spring out and about and that was like the highlight of my day some days. We weren't really talking to each other, but we were waving. We had dogs. So that was a bright spot in my early COVID quarantine days.
It's a big step, I think.
Yeah.
And I mean, we're fortunate to be in South Carolina where, for the most part, we can be out year round.
Yeah, it's very true. Yeah. And not as many people here, not as populated as a state. So yeah, we are very lucky for that.
Yeah. So a big part, I think, of establishing the goals and steps for moving is historically, I think in counseling, we've done things like having goals of not doing things. And so, even before you mentioned like, trying to stop certain behaviors. And I've noticed in working with couples, it's really hard to show improvement when what you're trying to do is not do things. And so if every time, your spouse says something and you kind of groan back or roll your eyes, and then that's a trigger point, by not doing that when that happens, if you still do it once, but you used to do it 20 times, often progress isn't perceived because you still did it. And so I prefer instead of trying not to do something, that we intentionally focus in the opposite direction. Because when we try not to do something, our focus stays on what we were trying not to do. And it actually prevents us from moving towards something that's intentional, and usually will fail because we're still focused on that negative thing that we don't want to do. And so our direction and our focus needs to be on a new goal, on something that we do want to do, instead of what we were trying not to do. And the example of students I used to work with in undergrad frequently that struggled with issues like pornography. If their only focus was on not looking at pornography, all they were thinking about, all they were trying not to do was look at pornography. And so they would eventually fall. And just because they didn't do that didn't mean that they would turn out the way that they wanted to. And so it's being careful to formulate goals that are positive and opposite of what we were trying not to do. And similar to addiction, the opposite of addiction is not necessarily sobriety, it's connection to other people.
Right. Yeah.
Which is some of Johan Hari's research. And so making sure that our focus, I kind of have three ways that we can adjust our focus. And the first is to recognize what our filters are, because of how important our perspective is, that we need to recognize what these filters are, what is informing our hypervigilance and causing us to feel alerted and unsafe, and then taking opportunities for reflection and reset, and then engaging holistic wellness, especially at this time of being in the same space, sitting in front of a computer all day long, is making sure that we care for our whole self. And part of this perspective shift is tied to the classic psychology research of not eating the marshmallow. It's one of my favorite studies to observe with little kids, is these poor little kids, right? They have this marshmallow in front of them. They're told not to eat it. And you have a variety of responses, some kids sniffing it and taking little pieces off. But the ones who seem to do well are the ones who turn completely around, who look at something different. And so for us, there tends not to be positive progress toward anything beneficial if we're only focused on the marshmallow, on the thing that we don't want to do. And so we need to make some of these changes by recognizing our filters, taking an opportunity for reflection and reset, and then engaging holistic wellness.
Yeah, I like that. I was thinking about the marshmallow. I remember that video. If people haven't seen it, maybe we can link the video in the show notes because it's really good. And I remember when we first saw that, we did it to our girls. We were really curious about what they would do. Yeah, so that's a really good way of putting it. Are you focusing on the marshmallow? Or are you able to shift your gaze and find something else to focus on? That's great. I like that.
So that first step is, what are we looking at?
Mm-hmm.
And then how are we interpreting what we're looking at? And so oftentimes with the issue of stress, we see something in front of us and we feel stressed, and we assume that whatever that thing is that we're experiencing is causing the stress. But it's important actually to recognize that the things that we think are the cause usually are not the cause of our stress. It's our perception or interpretation of that situation. This kind of gets into the REBT model of what is our belief? What is our belief about that situation? An example would be like bears, right? Mm-hmm. Ironically, teddy bears are one of the first things that many parents give their children for comfort. And hopefully we don't try to desensitize them to the fear of bears. But William James, one of the fathers of psychology, said that we don't run because we're afraid of bears. We're afraid of bears because we run. That we've kind of established this fear response. And so in most stressful situations, the reason why life feels stressful is because we are perceiving things as dangerous or as overwhelming. And so it's triggering our hypervigilance. It's triggering our stress response in our body and then creating a feedback loop. And as we experience fear follows this socially conditioned pathway, and that it's kind of strange in how we learn to fear, because it engages our whole self. It engages our perception of things, our cognitive interpretation of things, and then simulates our physiological response. And then once that pathway is established, our physiological response will activate our cognitive pathway. The amygdala and the thalamus will work together to signal fight-flight response. And that travels really quickly before we can evaluate whether this bear is a bear that we should be afraid of, or whether it's a bear that, like Yogi, is just trying to steal our picnic basket.
Right.
And so it's this process of recognizing for ourselves when this system is activated and being able to shift from fight-flight response, amygdala, thalamus, low road response, to prefrontal cortex, high road response, to interrupt the stress that we're experiencing.
Okay.
one of the important ways to do this is just even asking this question of what is feeding our threat response. And so considering like most people, usually in person, I'll ask, a group of people, do you feel safe right now? And most people will say no. And this means that their anterior cingulate of the cortex, their ACC, has atrophied, right? And they probably should get that looked at. That's not good. Because between the midbrain, the neocortex, under the corpus callosum, is this anterior cingulate cortex that is the traffic director of the electrical energy that we experience. And so when we're perceiving something, the ACC is the one that determines where this energy flows, low road or high road, for experiencing threat response. John Gottman, in his research with couples, refers to this as flooding, actually, in a discussion. So if you have a couple talking with each other, and his recommendation is that you wear a heartbeat monitor to be able to determine if your heartbeat goes over about 95, 96 beats per minute, it means that you are physiologically aroused and your blood is now flowing to your extremities in your hand, in your feet, to flee, and not to your prefrontal cortex. So your capacity to dialogue logically is reduced. And so for us, when we're considering this perspective, what's happening when the threat response is activated is that we're no longer able to engage our prefrontal cortex to effectively evaluate our current situation. We're now reacting instead of responding. And so in the same way that we would do this for our clients, we need to do it for ourselves and be able to disengage this threat response and shift the energy that we experience when we're perceiving something from the low road in the amygdala to a calm and regulated place in activating the prefrontal cortex.
Okay.
So this is the key for most trauma work, right? Is engaging this neuroception and connection between neuroception and interoception of how do I perceive the world around me and how does my body feel? How do I interpret this feeling? And is it accurate? And so being able to practice relaxation so that you can sense the difference between when you're relaxed and when you're not relaxed. Because what happens when we experience threat responses, our body tightens up, our muscles tense. And so if we establish habits around relaxation, we'll notice that difference. But if it's not a habit, what frequently happens with clients that I work with, and I'll go over this in a minute as well, but what usually happens is we tell clients that they need to work on coping skills. That's been on just about every treatment plan I've ever seen for everybody. And clients know it. They come in, they'll say, oh, I'm working on coping skills. And what this means is that when I'm overwhelmed, when I'm stressed, when I'm angry, I need to do something to change that. But when that is then associated with a negative thing, we don't do it. It's like trying to put a lid on an erupting volcano. It's too late. It's not going to work anymore.
Right.
Instead, we need to be able to recognize the signals of rumblings and reduce the stress and the explosive power before it gets too much. And so in order to do that, the habits that we create need to be habits. If we're going to use progressive muscle relaxation, deep breathing, mindfulness to be effective when we feel overwhelmed, it has to be a muscle memory go-to response that we do all of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree for sure. I'm nodding my head because I've been there and practicing those mindfulness and meditation techniques is very helpful. But like you said, you have to get into the habit of doing it. You really do. Yeah.
Yeah. So as counselors, it's this first step of saying, all right, well, what is our destination? Where are we going? And it's even, in a lot of the trauma work that we look at, like Rothschild talks about the importance of, in doing trauma work, because of mirror neurons, as our client is escalating or disengaging, we also probably are escalating and disengaging. So being aware and being able to engage our own relaxation response allows our clients to also feel safe. In the same way that, when I taught second and third grade boys Sunday school class, as the volume increases in the classroom, one of the best ways to calm them down is to talk quieter. So when you talk quieter, or for some reason, it's similar when you're, I don't know why this is somewhat of a universal thing, when you're driving and you're lost, people tend to turn the radio off or turn it down. I'm not sure what we think that accomplishes, but there's this sensation of like the softer it is, the quieter it is, the better I'm able to focus or concentrate.
Yeah, no, I do that with the car, with the radio for sure. But, I also have learned over the years and in my work, because where I work, I encounter a lot of energy. There's a lot of energy. Sometimes there's a lot of, I don't know what the word is, what I'm trying to say, but it's often I'm called in to help kind of bring things down a little bit. And if I were to go in there screaming and yelling like they're doing, it's not going to do anything. So I always think, okay, do the opposite, like just go in there and be calm, because people are drawn to the calming presence, even if it just kind of has them, look differently or look around the room, or something new has entered, a new agent of change or something has like come into the space. And even as a mom with my kids, sometimes I just want to scream because I've hit my limit and I can't take another blah, blah, blah. And, honestly, it's harder for me as a mom to do it than it is at work. I guess because I'm so close to it at home and I've just like, oh, but yeah, being more calm doesn't mean that I'm letting them get away with anything. It just means that, we have to like de-escalate and bring it down. So yeah, I can relate to that on a lot of different areas of my life, but it takes practice.
As it takes practice.
What you're talking about is we have to practice that. What are some of the ways that you recommend that people practice that?
Yeah, so I have 3 kind of contrasting concepts that I'd like to kind of establish as very practical skills. And so this first one, this means for intentional focus and holistic wellness, is this idea of what we've historically called coping skills versus what I call healthy habits. Again, because kind of coping skills or coping strategies, they're tools that are techniques that help us handle difficult situations, difficult emotions. They decrease stress. The problem is that our frequent association of coping skills are to negative things. And so because we have this negative association, they won't work because we don't practice them enough. And so in the same way that if we want to get in shape or we want to exercise, but every time we try it, we don't do it correctly, then we're sore. Mm-hmm. It's harder to do unless we can associate that soreness with something different. And so I kind of do a cognitive reframe with my clients and with the counselors that I supervise in trying to establish this rhythm of healthy habits. And Dean, in his book, Making Habits, Breaking Habits, defines a habit as acting without thinking or automaticity as a central component of a habit. So again, it's this idea of we've done something so many times that we engage it without even thinking about it. And this is tied to some of this idea of wholeness, or the fact that we are body, soul, spirit, all tied together, because in our stress response, our body is also tied to our thinking. So it's not sufficient usually to just try to change what our thinking is, because our body has already started. Before we can realize that it's not a bear, it's just something we thought was a bear, we're probably already 10 steps away because our body has intervened already. And so by establishing some of these habits, we can engage more effectively. So the 3 main characteristics of healthy habits are that we're vaguely aware of performing them. So they become so common that we're performing them without having to intentionally do them. And this is why it's important that they're healthy habits. We have lots of negative habits that we do all the time without having to think about them. But think of how helpful it is if we're doing things that are going to relax us and calm us without having to intentionally engage them. It's also emotionless, because we have so much energy already tied into having to engage in the situation. By having a habit that's just kind of just goes without having to deal with a difficult emotion, it's already working to increase our positive energy instead of deplete our negative energy. And then often we don't even notice its action. We're already doing it before we realize we need to do it, which is important. It's that some of that muscle memory and engagement with things that work. And so we can connect these things to different contexts. And one of the best ways to create some of these habits is to associate them with different things. And so again, recognizing that we're holistic, I try to tie it across kind of all of the person. And that I think because we are made as spiritual beings, we all need some sort of spiritual practice to make sure that we're engaging that aspect of ourselves. As you noted earlier, we need sleep. Research is saying that as a country, we're one of the most sleep deprived in the world and of all times. And so because we're all tied together, our capacity to think well, to respond well emotionally, to limit our ability to redirect our emotions is directly tied to our capacity with sleep. as well as then tied to nutrition and exercise. When we're tired, we don't want to exercise. When we're tired, we crave carbs. And so tying all of these different things together, well, we're getting sufficient water, that we're exercising 30 minutes a day so that our serotonin, dopamine are flowing correctly, so that it ties all of these aspects. We're outside walking, as you noted, and then tying in some of these, most of those things we know, right? It is interesting that as a country, we're able to continue to sell health and diet plans when for the most part, we know kind of what it takes to be healthy. It's just we're hoping for someone to do something that's easier. There's got to be a better way to do this. There's got to be a pill I can take to do this. But for the most part, we just have to do it. We have to do the hard work to do it. And so that ties into our emotional and physical pieces by just sitting down each day and observing, how am I feeling emotionally? How am I feeling physically, spiritually? What is my social well-being like? Trying to identify what some of those triggers are for activating events, for feelings and behaviors, using a REBT self-help form for ourselves, as we would do with our clients, to recognize any dysfunctional beliefs that we're using. And then I encourage all of my clients, and do this myself as well, of morning and evening practice of 5-count breath or deep breathing, of tensing and relaxing, of body scanning, of pelvic floor relaxation, progressive muscle relaxation, stretching, anchoring in the present, mindfulness. So all of those are patterns, again, that if you can associate it with a place and a time, 1 to 2 times a day, when you're feeling overwhelmed, you have that go-to skill to be able to apply.
Yeah.
And it's a habit instead of just trying to cope.
And it works. It works. I mean, it really, truly works. And I wouldn't be so enthusiastic about it if I didn't experience it in my own life. So you got to find what resonates with you and what you like and what works. And there's so many things out there that you can try: meditations, guided imagery. There's a lot. And like you said, just learning how to breathe deeply is very grounding and very helpful as well. So I like what you have definitely shared and encouraged.
Yeah, I mean, tied to this for counselors is a concept that we talk about a lot, is this idea of self-care. And again, I think self-care is probably useful language. I've talked with a lot of counselors that aren't good at self-care because the perception of it is it's selfish, or that it's an exception. And so again, instead of having something have a negative connotation, is that I tend to use the terminology of rhythm, that we need rhythms in our life. And that instead of having kind of self-care as the idea of needing to pause life, that we have rhythms in our life that are just incorporated as a pattern for what we do. Right. And making sure that we have kind of daily habits, like we talked about with the wellness, but also we have kind of weekly, seasonal, annual things that we're just practicing and engaging in on a regular basis, so that we don't need to stop and take time out to discharge or recharge, but it's already built into our time, and that we're regular each day, that we have time and rest and Sabbath, if you will, this component of like putting your phone down, letting your phone sleep when you sleep, disconnecting from technology, time with people. A lot of the literature follows like a Benedictine model of the rule of 4, which frequently has this idea of an hour a day a week a year of just engagement in rest and peace. And so following some sort of pattern and rhythm that you feel like will work for you, so that it's automatic. You don't have to try to schedule it. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to break from something else. It's just part of what you do.
Yeah, I like that. You said it's the rule of 4?
The rule of 4, yeah, it's a Benedictine concept. And there's been quite a bit written on it recently, which I think is helpful.
Yeah, I like that idea. And maybe I've been doing that and I didn't even realize it. But once I get into that habit or the routine of it, I want more of it. It's fascinating how that works. It's just, I think the hardest part for a lot of people is just getting started, seeing that they deserve it and that they need it. And it's by taking care of ourselves, we're actually providing better client and patient care.
Right.
It's really, truly, I do think there's some of it out there, maybe in the beginning, I'm seeing X amount of clients a week, and these are the type of themes I'm hearing and seeing, and in the beginning, I would be like, wow, that's amazing. You're just such a rock star therapist. And now when I hear somebody say that, it exhausts me.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, we're a culture of busyness. And that ties back, I think, to our identity as counselors, is when someone, talks to you and you're able to say, oh, well, I don't see anybody on Fridays, or, oh, I only work to this time. But often there's like shame associated with that. Or, if someone calls you first thing in the morning and say, oh, I'm sorry, did I wake you up? Our knee jerk, at least my knee jerk response is, oh, no, I've been awake for hours, right? Because
right.
we have this busyness is tied to our identity. And so we have to be busy to feel important, to feel valued. And so I think we need to be able to recognize that, to be careful with that, because that's not where our worth comes from. That's not where our value is.
Yeah, that is so true. And that's such an important note, really, really, truly is. I'm glad you said that. And, I go to that place of I'm a woman, I'm a mom, I work full time, I have this podcast, I have all these things. I'm so busy. See how important I am? And at the end of the day, that's not what's important. It's family, time with our girls, mothering, being a wife. For me, those are where my values are. The other things I do, they're passions, they're for fun, they're my livelihood, but they're not everything. Everything. If those things went away, I would still have what I needed and what I wanted.
Yeah.
So
yeah, there's one more comparison, and I think it's an important one right now, right? Is this idea of safety versus growth. If our priority is safety, then we get encapsulated. If we view things as fragile, then we don't challenge anything. And the reality is actually that as people, we are anti-fragile. We are not fragile. So the concept of anti-fragile is kind of like muscles, is that muscles don't need to be protected from use to be safe. They actually have to be put to use or they'll atrophy. So the idea of anti-fragile is you have fragile and you have anti-fragile as growth mindset components of we need to be challenged in order to be resilient. We have to struggle. In order to build muscle, we have to tear muscle. Those are those pieces of growth that's so important. And so even as Carol Dweck says, that this idea of growth mindset is the belief that our basic qualities can be cultivated through the effort that we exert, and that everyone can change and grow through application and experience, which is just so important. It's this idea, especially in this mindset, and it's hard when there is a real tension between safety right now, but it's not allowing safety, in my opinion, to fill your vision. Because if your goal is safety, then you won't do anything. The reality is, as the wise therapist Siggy in What About Bob says, Siggy is my favorite character in that movie. And he says that we're all going to die, right? We're all going to die. And that's true. No matter what we do, if we live in a room of padded acorn, whatever those things are that you're holding, right? If we live in a padded room of bubble wrap and we don't ever hurt ourselves, we actually live less. Failure to thrive. And so the reality of growth is that we have to push from our comfort zone through our fear zone in order to be able to learn and grow. And I think a big thing that's happening with the clients that I'm working with is because of fear, because of promotion of safety, their tolerance for discomfort is reducing. And so their range of tolerance between comfort and panic is very small. And so as people, both for ourselves as counselors and the people we work with, we have to push against that, and we have to try to expand their growth zone and increase their distress tolerance, like DBT and REBT, increase their distress tolerance so that they can grow. Because in pursuing safety only, we will never grow. So being okay with suffering, being okay with struggle, being okay with failure is what builds resilience. And I think as people, but especially as counselors, we need to be careful not to jump in and fix, not to try to make people comfortable, but allow them to experience discomfort as part of the growth and learning process.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree with you more on those points. I'm taking it all in and I'm thinking it through, and I'm thinking about clients. I'm thinking about my life. I'm thinking about my neighbors. I'm thinking about so many things. And this has been such a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for coming onto the show and giving us your wisdom and your knowledge. And so for those of you guys that are wanting to purchase the continuing education contact hour, you can head to the site, lisamustard.com. And don't forget, you get your first one free. So when you sign up on my website, you'll get a code emailed to you. You'll get your first pod course for free. So be sure to grab that. And all the show notes, all the references, everything will be on the website. So Dr. Scott, if folks want to learn more about you, where should they go?
They can actually go to my website, which is sethlscott.com, SETHLSCOTT.com. And it has my research, my contact information, my training, and all of those things on that site.
Cool. Well, I'll put that in the show notes. We'll link to that for sure. And gosh, once again, thank you so much. This has been great.
It's great. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Well, that wraps up another episode of The Therapy Show with Lisa Mustard. I know there are hundreds of thousands of podcasts out there, and I'm thankful you've chosen to listen to mine.
Be sure to visit lisamustard.com to access the show notes and discover more fantastic content.
And I'd be grateful if you subscribe to the show. Thank you.